Max, and thank you everyone for being here. So one of the sad things here is that I really actually didn't have to prepare very much in the way of remarks for this event, because the fact is we've been here many times before. And the fact is we've had to talk about this issue over and over and over again. And today we're again talking about the very American epidemic of gun violence. We're talking again about innocent lives senselessly lost in this brutally efficient way that results from easy access to guns. And we're wondering, again, how we got here, why this keeps happening, and what we've done about it since last time. Now, unfortunately, in this country, last time never ends up being really that long ago, right? Because remember, it was not even 2 weeks ago that we were mourning our nation's last large-scale mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. And today, of course, we're still processing our grief about the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, in which 19 fourth grade children and 2 teachers were brutally slaughtered while celebrating the last day of school in a place that they deserved to feel safe. It keeps happening, and sometimes it feels like it never stops. So Atlanta, of course, is no stranger to mass shootings ourselves. It's been barely a year, after all, since we were all mourning our own homegrown tragedy when on March 16th, 2021, another gunman who purchased his firearm that very same morning murdered 8 people in a rampage that rocked the nation's Asian American community to its core. And it's fair to ask, in the wake of that tragedy, how our state leadership has responded. What has our governor done to make Georgians safer from gun violence? And the short answer is nothing. Nothing. Despite Georgia Democrats dropping a number of common sense gun safety bills since 2021, including universal background checks, mandatory waiting periods, and safe storage laws, the GOP majority legislature and Governor Kemp have not lifted a finger to make our community safer from gun violence. Not only that, but this year, Governor Kemp actively pushed as his flagship piece of legislation a bill removing all restrictions from carrying loaded weapons in public. So the governor signed this bill into law despite opposition from 70% of Georgians, and literally on the same day as yet another mass shooting on a New York City subway train. Which leads me to ask, is the governor truly that out of sync with what the vast majority of people in Georgia want? Or is it that he just doesn't care? So this most recent slaughter of school children is unfortunately going to enter into our cultural lexicon and become shorthand for this type of mass shooting we continue to see, right? There was Columbine, Parkland, and now Uvalde. And so as legislators and as public leaders tasked with the goal of protecting our communities and standing in that gap between danger and ideology, I'd like our state Republicans, in particular Governor Kemp, who have so long stood in the way of common sense gun safety regulation, to take this moral inventory for themselves. Look at the pictures of those victims and then ask yourself, how would you feel if those were your kids, your spouse, your parent? What would you want done? What is in your power to do now? What is stopping you? Are you more scared than they were? And how will you explain this to your own kids, what you did in this moment? And if that answer is and continues to be nothing, then ask yourselves why you deserve to serve Georgia. I'd like now to introduce my colleague and my good friend, Representative Sam Park.
Thank you, Senator Al. Brian Kemp has shown time and again that he'll prioritize his reelection over the safety of the people of Georgia. His extreme permitless carry law succeeded in gaining him Republican primary votes, but it showed the 70% of Georgians that oppose this law that he's willing to gamble with their lives to gain those votes. The governor's decision to sign this dangerous bill into law comes as a new report from the CDC found that gun deaths have soared to historic heights in the United States. In Georgia, the rate of gun deaths has risen 41% from 2011 to 2020. And our state has the 17th highest rate of gun deaths in the nation. But instead of addressing this crisis, Brian Kemp is pushing us backwards on gun safety. Permitless carry bills have proven deadly consequences. Other states that have passed similar laws saw aggravated assaults with a gun spike by up to 65%. And states that weakened their gun permitting systems have seen a 15% increase in violent crime. Kemp's extreme permitless carry law is alarming and poses great risk to the safety of Georgia families and communities. Unfortunately, Georgia's AAPI community understands the dangers of gun violence and the urgent need to keep guns away from those who shouldn't be carrying deadly weapons. In just the past couple of weeks, we've seen a racially motivated mass shooting in Buffalo that left 10 people dead, and a tragic, heartbreaking mass shooting at an elementary school in Texas that left 19 little children and two teachers dead. These shootings and many more that happen every day in America are heartbreaking and avoidable. Just like the evil we saw days ago on display in Buffalo and Uvalde, we've witnessed that same evil right here in the Atlanta area. But instead of honoring those victims by doing everything possible to try and ensure nothing similar ever happens again, Brian Kemp and Georgia Republicans have decided to make it even easier for criminals to carry weapons of war in public. No election is worth more than our lives, and Georgians deserve better than someone who's proven he has no problem risking our safety to win an election. Brian Kemp has failed us and proven himself unfit for the office of governor. With that, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Mr. Kanan.
Thank you, Representative Park. My name is Kannan Udayarajan, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Forsyth County Democrats and a state committee member of the Democratic Party of Georgia. But I'm a parent too. So let me start off by giving some personal context on this topic. I grew up in India, where it is very difficult to obtain guns for private citizens. During my school days, we never had to worry about gun violence on a day-to-day basis. We didn't have active shooter trainings because gun violence was non-existent. I've been living here in the US for 15 years, and we have 2 elementary school children. My daughter graduated from 5th grade yesterday, and I was asking her what her biggest fears was going to middle school. She mentioned grades, homework, boys, and a random gunman shooting at children. We live in a dystopian situation where elementary school children are worrying about gun violence at an age they should be worrying about kid stuff. If you look at the numbers, there were 34 school shootings in 2021. We are only in the 5th month of this year, and there has already been 27 school shootings, including the horrific incident this week in Texas. And just a few weeks back, we had a woman shooting at a school bus in Gwinnett County. Now, I have lived here for 15 years, and I understand the historical context, the constitutional context, and the cultural context of guns in the US. I understand the values and the desire for gun ownership. We all respect that. We don't have a problem with the responsible gun ownership, but we do need to have checks and balances so that guns do not end up in the wrong hands. If you think about it, you need to be 21 years of age to buy cigarettes or alcohol, but you only need to be 18 years to buy an assault weapon. You need to get training, pass the written test, and a driving test to get a driving license. Why don't we have similar checks and balances for gun ownership? And this is why it is important to ask, why did Brian Kemp push so hard to pass permitless carry? And more importantly, what is he enabling through this policy when our children are scared on a daily basis? We are losing faith in the system. Children are losing faith in our ability to keep them safe. And we are all losing faith in our governor's ability to prioritize his citizen safety over politics. And this concern is shared not just by members of the AAPI community, but by a vast majority of Georgians. I want to close off by saying that our children, our communities, Georgia deserves a governor who will put their safety over politics. Thank you, and now you'll hear from Robert. Thank you.
Thank you, Conan. My name is Robert Peterson, and I'm the youngest son of young AU, who was murdered in March 2021 mass shooting targeting Asian American women in the Atlanta area. So gun violence is a personal issue for me. Gun violence is the reason my mother and 7 other victims are not here with us today to enjoy their lives and families. It's why people in my community no longer feel safe going to work, school, to the grocery store, riding MARTA, or going about our daily lives. The gunman who murdered my mother was able to obtain a gun the same day he decided to carry out his crime across 2 counties in Georgia. During that time, Brian Kemp said he cared about our community and he offered his thoughts and prayers, but no action. And as gun violence is rising across the country and in Georgia, it's an absolute necessity and paramount to our safety that we ensure there are checks and accountability when it comes to who is carrying firearms in our community. Brian Kemp's permitless carry law weakens Georgia's system of accountability and makes us all less safe. It removes the crucial step of needing to pass a background check before being allowed to carry a concealed gun in public. To put it simply, Kemp has weakened our gun safety laws and put communities at risk by allowing people to bypass that crucial check and carry deadly weapons out in public. Permitless carry is moving Georgia backwards on gun safety. We need a governor who will make sure we have accountability and that everyone who's acquiring or carrying guns undergoes a background check, a thorough background check. This isn't a controversial or partisan idea. A vast majority of gun owners, Democrats, Republicans, and independents support a full background check to carry a firearm. But Brian Kemp signed a permitless carry law anyway, making us all less safe. That's not what a governor should do. Our leaders should be working for us and prioritizing our safety. By pushing this dangerous permitless carry law, Brian Kemp is showing us that he doesn't care. Our safety isn't his top priority. His reelection campaign is. Thank you. And I'd now like to introduce you to Mr. Michael Webb.
Thank you, Robert. It's good to see you again. My name is Michael Webb. I was married to Xiaojie Tan, who was murdered last year in the mass shooting that targeted Asian American women in Atlanta. We have a daughter together. She was a mother, owned a home and 2 businesses, including Young's Asian Massage, where the first shooting occurred. Let me be clear. I'm a gun owner and I'm a hunter. Furthermore, I support our rights to own a firearm, but I also support common sense gun control and gun safety. The young man who executed my daughter's mother and 7 other innocent people did so within hours of purchasing a gun here in Georgia. The young man who killed 21 people in Texas did so after purchasing 2 assault rifles within days of his 18th birthday. As we all know, 19 of them were precious, innocent school children. Like Senator Al said, this is an American epidemic. After the shooting here, President Biden came to Atlanta. His visit was followed by a bus full of US senators and members of Congress, all meeting with the family's victim, all crying out for our leaders to do something about gun control. But our own governor never called or came to visit. Instead, as we were all mourning the first anniversary of the shootings, he was busy signing and celebrating Georgia's new permitless carry law, which 7 of 10 Georgians oppose. By pushing a law that risks lives, Brian Kemp has shown that he's not a leader and he's not up to the job. For him, his political career is more about Georgians, is more important than Georgians' safety. Now, I'm not a liberal or a Democrat. I'm just a father, grandfather, and victim of gun violence. In 1999, I received a call that my 18-year-old son committed suicide. They said I needed to come and identify his body. He killed himself with a loaded shotgun that was carelessly stored in plain sight by his grandparents. Make no mistake, suicide is gun violence, and it's the leading cause of gun-related deaths in America. Then a year ago, while sitting at a funeral home here in Georgia, I had to plead with my grieving daughter not to see her mother one last time. Imagine for a moment what those parents of those 19 little school children in Texas are going through right now. We cannot remain silent just because the vocal minority will attempt to drown out those of us who speak out about guns. Stop already with the moments of silence and the thoughts and prayers after each massacre. Governor Kemp, Georgia leaders, do something. Quit making this political. Stop trading lives for votes. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Max.
Thank you, Mr. Webb. At this time, we'll open it up for some questions from members of the media. You can use the raise hand function and I can recognize you to ask your question. Right. All right, we have a question from Alia with the AJC. Alia, I'm gonna unmute you now.
Hi, everyone. Can y'all hear me? Hello? Okay, I think this works. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we can
Yes,
hear
we
you.
can hear you.
Okay. For the lawmakers on the call, is there anything that you are planning to try next legislative session that is either new or the same sort of proposed legislation that you've tried before, but you think it might have a better chance for some reason next time around?
Let me start with this, and then I'm going to pass it off to Representative Park to answer this. So you've alluded to the fact that we have consistently tried to pass gun safety legislation. In fact, immediately in the wake of the shootings on March 16th in 2021, the AAPI Legislative Caucus dropped a slate of public safety bills, one of which was a gun safety bill regarding having a waiting period for the purchase of a firearm. Again, just to cite the event of March 16th, that the gunman purchased that weapon used in the murders that same morning, and by that evening had used it to kill 8 people. There are other forms of gun legislation that we've dropped in the past that have gotten exactly nowhere. Again, in this Republican trifecta legislature, not only have the bills not passed and been signed into law, they've been blocked at the point that they haven't even been given the courtesy of being heard in committee, which is literally the first step in the legislative process. So they won't even let us talk about it, right? They won't even let us discuss the bills because they are so afraid of having to publicly vote against legislation that the majority of Georgians want and having their name tied to voting no on common sense gun safety policies. So I know that from our standpoint, we are not going to give up because the environment around gun safety is changing. And with each successive tragedy, I think that we're creating an environment where people are going to demand that our leaders start to at least have this conversation in public about passing or at least discussing common sense gun safety legislation. So at least from my point of view, and I think the Representative Park agrees, we're going to continue to drop the universal background check bill, having a waiting period, and safe storage laws. Again, very common sense things that are supported by a majority of Georgians. And really, it's going to take time and it's going to take pressure like this to cause them to move. But times are changing and they cannot continue to refuse to listen and refuse to act. Representative Park, do you have anything to add to that?
I think the one thing I would add is elections matter. And certainly this year, Georgia voters have an opportunity to elect leaders who support common sense gun safety reform. Certainly as members of the legislature, we'll continue to do our part in not only introducing pieces of legislation, but trying to find common ground with legislators across the aisle, because this should not be a partisan issue. This should not be a political issue. This is a public safety issue. But as voters, we also have to recognize our responsibility in ensuring that we have leaders who understand that this is good public safety, common sense legislation that is necessary to stop these tragedies from continuing to occur in this country.
Right. We have another question from Sam Gringlas with WABE.
Hi there. Thanks for putting this together. You alluded to this a little bit in your last answer, but I wonder what new powers you would have in a potential Abrams administration, but where the legislature is still controlled by Republicans in both chambers. Does that open up any new avenues for policy change, or as long as the legislature remains controlled by Republicans, there's not a whole lot of new things or changes that you all have the power to make?
So I'd be happy to take the lead on that question. So I think it's important to recognize that Georgia Republicans, they haven't been doing nothing when it comes to the gun epidemic in America. They've exacerbated the gun epidemic. They've been pouring fuel on the fire by allowing it to be easier to carry a gun without a permit. and have really fostered the proliferation of guns, whether it was legislation to allow guns everywhere in the state of Georgia, whether it was allow folks from out of state to bring their gun into Georgia, which is legislation that they passed this year, or whether it was to try and allow guns in churches, which I think nearly every single Republican in the state of Georgia voted yes to allow. Though thankfully, it wasn't signed into law. And so having a Democratic governor named Stacey Abrams is such an important bulwark and a safety mechanism to veto these harmful initiatives that make it and that increase the chance of gun violence in the state of Georgia. Second, I think having a Democratic governor to break that Republican trifecta such that our state is no longer beholden to this vocal minority regarding this critical issue, I think will allow and ensure that there's more of an opportunity to find common ground when it comes to gun safety reform that is, again, so clearly needed.
All right, now we have a question from Kanwal.
Hi, so this is Kamal here from Mera Sangeet. We are an online radio station for the South Asians, and I was listening to everyone here, especially Kananji, talking about India and how, getting a license for guns in India is a totally different matter altogether. But now here in the United States, this one particular incident that's happened in Texas has kind of, triggered everybody's conscience. Everybody's talking about it, that we need to put an issue to this. It's like a never ending issue. Every day you're hearing about some case here or there. And so what is the way forward? While we also talk about trying to put an end to, to getting gun licenses, or in a way to kind of curb it in some manner, what other measures do you think can we take? Is mental health also there in the agenda? Can this also be taken into account? What all is it that is being, propagated at this point or talked about? And what is the way forward, basically?
I'll start, and then I want Kanan to also weigh in. I think how we have to approach the issue of gun violence, the epidemic of gun violence, as I tend to like to call it, as a public health issue, just like any other, right? I think oftentimes when we're being very simplistic, as we tend to be in politics, when we talk about gun safety measures, that the other side, the antagonists of passing gun safety regulation, they say, well, this one measure wouldn't work, so why bother? This one measure won't work either, so there's no point. Any public health issue needs to be hit at from many different ways, right? And I think that you alluded to this in your question. Just like the issue of vehicular safety, right? No one's saying that seatbelts themselves prevent all types of vehicular injury, right? But it's the layering, as we've learned in this last pandemic, the layering of public safety measures that lead to decrease in deaths from vehicular accidents, including seatbelts, airbags, traffic signs, drunk driving laws, all these types of things, right? So we really have to look at the issue of gun violence as a public health issue and think of the different ways that we can come at it, including things like universal background checks, including things like age limits for buying weapons, including things like having bans on assault rifles, including things like red flag laws. We have to come at it from a lot of different ways because there are a lot of different reasons that people are victims of gun violence, including things like mental health issues, suicide, as Mr. Webb alluded to, domestic violence. Mass shootings are really actually only a small portion of the fatalities we see from gun violence, but they're the ones that unfortunately tend to get the most attention. And maybe the one thing that we can use is that it tends to galvanize people to want to act. So I would encourage people to think of it as a public health issue and to try to find many different multifocal solutions to deal with this problem.
Thank you, Senator. What I want to add is that as community members and especially media organizations, the most important thing that we have to do is to keep this conversation active at all times. We shouldn't be reacting when something tragic happens. We should be keeping this conversation active, having conversations with our friends, family members in our communities, about how fundamental this is, and how not normal this is. Public health, public safety is fundamental. Thinking about gun violence on a day-to-day basis, children thinking about it when they go to school is not normal. It's dystopian, like I mentioned earlier. So the request that I have to all media organizations and to community members is that let's keep this conversation active. Let's not stop with press conferences. Let's not stop with legislation. Let's not stop with voicing our opinions, but coming together as communities, and making sure, like Senator Au mentioned earlier, keeping the pressure on, until we have common sense gun laws in this country.
One thing I would add real quickly is, I think we have to recognize that this is a very American epidemic, in which, to the degree in which mass shootings in this country happen with such frequency compared to in other countries around the world, this is a policy choice. With good public policy, with changes in our laws, we can ensure and protect our constitutional rights, but also protect lives. We can save lives. And I think we have to recognize as voters and as Americans that we have the power to make progress on this very challenging issue. But certainly, no matter how long it may take, we have to do so, especially in a comprehensive manner, as Senator Michelle Alice stated.
Right, we have another question now that comes from Sung Hong with News and Post. She does not have a microphone, so I'm going to read it. She says, even you say it's not a partisan issue, how can you convince Kemp or other GOP members to discuss and make gun safety legislation? Is there any movement to come together and discuss it?
I would say at this point, it's a matter of holding Governor Kemp and these elected officials who voted for such legislation accountable. We as voters have an opportunity to hold them accountable for the legislation that they've passed and for putting our communities at greater risk of gun violence based on what we know and the effect that these laws have had in other states where they've been enacted. And so, again, this is an opportunity in which Georgia voters have to understand what Governor Kemp has done. And again, to use their own individual power, hopefully to hold all of us accountable, but certainly Governor Kemp and Republicans for signing these laws or these pieces of legislation into law. And come next year, after the dust has settled, we will continue to engage with folks across the political spectrum to talk about this issue, because again, whether you are a Democrat or Republican or an independent, we should all be working to protect our communities and help save lives in the state of Georgia and around this country.
I want to make one important point that I think sometimes we lose track of, which is that the job of an elected representative is to represent the interests of their community, right? Their job is not to represent what their own personal interests are, and their job is certainly not to serve the interests of a political lobby like the gun lobby, right? So when the governor or any legislator, including me, including Representative Park, are hearing from the vast majority of people in our community that they want more gun safety legislation to pass, that they are sick of these stories coming out. Every single week, we're hearing about another gun violence tragedy. To continue to not act, you are not doing your job, right? So if you are unable to serve the public that you've been elected to serve, and you cannot listen to what the vast majority of the people that elected you want, then it's time for you to get out of this job.
I see 3 more hands raised. So we're just gonna do those 3 questions and then we're going to end the press conference. So I will recognize each and you can ask your question.
Hello. Thank you again for speaking with us today. I wanted to talk about mental health in the AAPI community and how this relates to gun safety and gun control. So the discussion of mental health typically arises with these other discussions about gun safety. And in the AAPI community, there's evidence to say that we don't express our mental health struggles due to stigmas, such as fear of bringing family shame and showing signs of weakness. I'm curious if you believe these struggles to speak out about our mental health problems in the AAPI community will affect the way that we approach the discussion of gun safety and gun control in the AAPI community.
It's a great question. Certainly, the stigma and shame when it comes to mental health related issues within the Asian American community are real. But I think, especially when we're talking about mass shootings and the epidemic of violence being a public health issue that affects all of us, certainly this is an issue in which we have to continue to work together to speak out on. Now, when it comes to mental health, I would also add expanding access to healthcare, expanding Medicaid in the state of Georgia would go a long way to ensure that Asian Americans have access to mental health services. But again, when it comes to fighting the epidemic of gun violence, it's a challenge, and we have to address the issue in a comprehensive manner, including trying to address, and increase access to mental health care as well.
I want to point out again that while mass shootings tend to get the lion's share of the attention when it comes to gun violence, really the top type of gun violence that we see in this country is suicide, right? Suicide takes the most lives in the form of gun violence in this country, both because of, as you noted, having stigma around mental health, people being reluctant to seek mental health care, and also the lethality of using firearms as a means of inflicting suicide. So I think that there's two things that we need to talk about. One is I do think that there is, as you noted, a stigma within the AAPI community around seeking mental health care. I think that's probably true across all communities, but in particular in the AAPI community, it is not talked about enough, right? And we know that among AAPI youth in particular, especially in these past few years, that there has been a spike in terms of suicides within the AAPI community in our young people and adolescents. So I think that having increased conversations, especially among young people, especially among those who are at risk, can work to decrease that stigma, right? It's going to be something there are no quick fixes to this, but it's something that has to be part of a cultural change that we need to start to work on. And the second thing of that is to continue to work from our side, in terms of the legislative side, to continue to expand access to mental health care. This year, we actually were successful in passing an omnibus mental health care access bill, which is going to go quite some way in terms of getting patients the care that they need. But it's not just having the care available, it's having people know to ask for it and to seek it. So these are conversations we're going to need to continue to have both within our community and in the community at large.
All right, we have two more questions. When I introduce you to speak, please just say your name and the outlet you're with, just so our participants can be aware.
Hi, this is Jeff Ami with the Associated Press. I was just wondering if Mr. Webb and Mr. Peterson could talk about one or two steps that they would be in favor of that they think should be prioritized.
Well, I'll start. There's over 400 million guns in America, more guns than people. And the facts are that the more guns there are anywhere, the more gun violence. So making it a little harder to get guns. Let's start with maybe universal waiting periods. I feel reasonably confident, knowing the evidence, that the mother of my daughter would be alive had there just been a 3 or a 5 day waiting period. We have it in other states, universal background checks, of course. And I'm really beginning to think that there needs to be significant requirements, difficult requirements to purchase these assault rifles. They're made to kill people. They're not made for sport. So let's start there.
Yeah, and I would second that. I definitely support waiting periods. Again, I support a ban on assault weapons. But more importantly, with my public health background, I also support the increase in data and recording the purchasing and selling of guns and the deaths accountable by guns. Again, looking at it from a public health standpoint, allowing the CDC to be able to document and title these things. So it helps us to have the data that we need to push forward on these legislative policies that we have. So that would be something I also would like to see.
All right, I think that was our final question. Before we wrap, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining, all of our participants, Mr. Webb, Mr. Peterson, Kanan, Rep Park, Senator Al. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your voices and your stories. And thank you to all the members of the media who joined as well. Take care.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you.